I've been attending and supporting the UU Fellowship here for about 30 years, but I have never become a member. So why am I up here talking to you in this sequence on faith journeys? I think I owe you an explanation, and I hope it'll come through as I tell you about my own spiritual journey, one that does connect with Unitarian principles. Your UU bulletin says, our living traditions include wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings which inspire us. And often at the beginning of the service, we hear, we draw inspiration from, among other things, sacred texts. Well, it turns out that my spiritual journey led to the study of such texts and their Jewish wisdom. Where did the journey begin? I was born into a family with a long tradition of liberal Judaism. So I received a Jewish upbringing. From the age of 10 to 13, I was sent to religious school every Tuesday and Thursday after public school let out, and I attended Sabbath services for 3 hours every Saturday morning. Near the age of 13, I had my bar mitzvah. That very night, there was a fire in the synagogue. I evidently took it as an omen, so I had very little to do with Judaism for the next 35 years. In truth, even as a boy, I had already had a belly full. The Judaism that had been presented to me had necessarily been watered down and storyfied to make it comprehensible to children. My growing adolescent mind found nothing in it that made sense or seemed important. Yet I still felt that I could be in the Jewish tradition. After all, one of the first great rabbis, Rabbi Hillel the Elder, who died in the year 10, said this, the golden rule essentially, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto your fellow. That is the whole Hebrew Bible. The rest is explanation. Go and study. Well, I could do that. For the next decades, I studied a lot. I studied math, I studied science, literature, medicine, but not religious texts, as I am sure that quote intended. When I came to Bozeman at the age of 47, there were not a lot of Jewish people around, but there were a few who had loosely organized to observe a few of the Jewish holidays. They quickly found me and asked me to participate, which I did. I felt that I needed to support the presence of Judaism in Montana and add to the visibility of it in this area. And I have been a member of Congregation Beth Shalom ever since. However, even in those early years, Amanda and I were attracted to the community and activity of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Bozeman, and I was doing as much, if not more, with UUFB than with Congregation Beth Shalom. But still, I did not sign the membership book. Being Jewish is not entirely a matter of choice. Among Jews, if your parents were Jewish, you are Jewish. And with memories of the Spanish Inquisition and other instances of suppression of Jewish observance, Judaism asks that its adherents not join other religions. That and my own family history, its tradition of Judaism, is why I am a friend of UU and not a member. About 16 years ago, Rabbi Ed Staffman came to Bozeman as a settled rabbi and introduced new things to the congregation, including a weekly Saturday morning Torah study. About 25 of us have continued to meet since then, most Saturday mornings, to discuss Torah and eat bagels. It introduced me to a new way of looking at my inherited religion. It turned out to be the destination of my spiritual journey and my practice of both Jewish and UU traditions of seeking wisdom in old religion and sacred texts. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about why it appeals to me. Well, what is the Torah? What is Torah? The Torah is traditionally preserved as a Hebrew scroll, but it's also printed as a book with English translation and a lot of commentary. It comprises the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, that is the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, and so forth. It was compiled beginning about 500 BCE and finalized by the rabbis about 500 years later. There is much diversity in Judaism about its origins. Very fundamentalist Jews believe that it's the Word of God, dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai. To liberal humanistic Jews like myself, it is the myths and ethics of biblical times compiled from many sources by the religious leaders of those and later times. What you're hearing is my view of Torah and Judaism. Were a rabbi or even another Jew to give this talk, it would probably be very different. There's a Jewish saying, where there are 2 Jews in a room, there are at least 3 opinions. The Torah text has 2 major categories. First, the mythology, history, and fables of the Israelite people. Second, laws of behavior and religious observance. They're not separate parts, they're all mixed together. And for ritual purposes, these 5 books of Moses are arbitrarily divided into as many weeks as there are in the year. They are read during community prayers and studied in groups on Saturday mornings. In groups. It is an important Jewish tradition that one should study Torah and possibly other things with at least one other person, and even better, in a group. Why? Because your opinion is probably not the only, your interpretation is probably not the only one, and it might even be wrong. We start Genesis each fall after the Jewish New Year and end with Deuteronomy a year later. And then we start over. And doesn't that get repetitious and dull, I hear you ask? Well, not really. Let me explain. First of all, we really do not discuss the whole portion of the week in any one year. Each part is way too long for that. Second, although the text remains the same, we change, the world changes, and the Torah's relevance to our lives changes. And third, we read and discuss other parts of the Bible that relate to the portion of the week, and we read commentary on that portion. My friends, there is a lot of commentary. I asked our friend Rabbi Staffman, how many volumes of commentary are there? His literal reply, thousands upon thousands, big libraries full. And so you have the question, why has so much commentary been written? Well, for one thing, the Torah was written began to be written thousands of years ago. And so scholars over the subsequent millennia have interpreted it to make it relevant to their times. To interpret it and make it relevant to their times. And it needs interpretation. Much of the Hebrew Bible does not make sense or is self-contradictory. That does not come through in the King James Version. And it's not surprising. Hebrew was it was written in Hebrew, and it's not surprising because Hebrew was not a spoken language for over 1,000 years, and meanings of certain words are lost. Also, there may have been mistakes in transcription, probably there were. And finally, the piecing together of many stories may have led to inconsistencies and contradictions in the narratives. The commentaries, written over 2,000-year period, aim to deal with some of these issues. So what makes up the commentary? We have the Mishnah beginning in 200 CE and the Gemara of around 500, which together comprises the Talmud. 11th century commentary of Rashi, who tried to make the meaning of the Torah consistent, the writings of scholars such as the 12th century physician Maimonides, who codified the laws of Jewish observance and tried to make the whole thing consistent with the philosophy of Aristotle. The Kabbalistic mystical commentaries such as the Zohar in the 15th century and later. The list goes on and on and on until the 1800s for the most fundamentalist Jews, and up until the present time for the most liberal of us. But of course, these commentaries don't agree with each other. The authors argue with their contemporaries and the writings of their predecessors. The commentaries and the Torah sometimes raise very philosophical and surprisingly complex ideas, great food for thought. For example, here is what Maimonides said about God, a character who turns up fairly frequently in Torah. All we understand is the fact that God exists, that God is a being to whom no creature is similar, who has nothing in common with them, whose relation to the universe is that of a steersman, and even that simile is not real. We are given only the idea that God rules the universe, gives it duration, and preserves its necessary arrangement. We cannot say what God is, only what God is not. Well, I bring this up because that is sure not the understanding of God that I got as a child in Hebrew school. And it turns out that the Jewish concept of God has changed over time from that in Genesis to later portions of the Bible to Maimonides and beyond. But most issues and discussions in the text are more down to earth. The dietary laws in the Bible raise the issue of what is kosher. But for us today, discussions of ethical eating, of environmentally sensitive eating. Some relate to laws and ethics. Should there be a death penalty? The text says an eye for an eye, but do we take it literally? What constraints on that should there be? How is a person to be compensated for a wrong? What are our obligations to the sick, the bereaved, the poor? Great questions for our discussions. But seldom is the outcome simple or ambiguous. There's usually an argument, or let's call it a discussion, but it is a civil and respectful discussion, a discussion that does not try to skirt the unavoidable complexity and ambiguity of difficult issues. There's a Jewish joke about a congregation in a little town. They could not agree whether a certain important prayer in the service should be said while the congregation was sitting down or while they were standing up. And it was a problem because every time they came to this prayer in the service, a big argument broke out about whether they should be sitting or standing, and it's totally destroyed the mood and flow of the service. So finally they decided they had to go get an answer to this question, so they went to see a rabbi in a nearby city, a learned rabbi in a nearby city. And when they were before the rabbi, first, those who favored standing energetically presented their well-researched argument that the prayer should be said standing up. And as they were going through this argument, the rabbi starts to stroke his beard and shake his head and say, no, that is not the tradition, which of course made the sitters ecstatic because they felt that they were going to win this battle. And they got up and summarized their argument about why it was appropriate to say this argument sitting. And as they got to the middle of their argument, the rabbi is stroking his beard and saying, no, that's not the tradition either. And so exasperated, both sides said, well, what is the tradition? Every time we get to that part of the service, it just breaks out into an argument and the rabbi starts to nod. Yes, that is the tradition. And it's not just a joke. There's a similar story in the Talmud about two famous second-century rabbis, Akiva and Shammai. They and their respective followers were arguing a point of Torah. It reads, "For 3 years, followers of Shammai and followers of Akiva disagreed. These said, the law is in accordance with our opinion, and those said, the law is in accordance with our opinion. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God." Both stories say one has to live with ambiguity. But if it all leads to argument and ambiguity, is such study just a waste of time? I mean, even the ancient rabbis argued about whether it was more important to study Torah, to go out and act for justice and good, or as Michelle Obama said, do something. But the other side argued that you had to study Torah to know what justice and what good to do. Or as stated by Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great 20th century rabbi, scholar, and human rights activist who marched with Martin Luther King, said, "Speech has power. Words do not fade. What starts out as a sound ends in a deed." So this Torah study, in my view, reflects the value of religion. Religion is a practice which hopefully produces a state of mind, an attitude, a disposition, which can lead you to do something, to be the best person you can be. For some, the practice is worship, for some meditation, for some ritual. It turned out to be Torah study for me. We recently had a Torah study about a biblical character named Korach, who started a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and about what happened to him and the Israelites as a result. By what authority were Moses and Aaron in charge of the Israelites, their religion, their politics? At other times, God had said everyone was equally holy. The text and commentaries led to a discussion of leadership, how leaders are chosen, the use and misuse of power, the voice of the people versus the power of government, and conflict resolution. Are these relevant issues today? Does talking about them help one decide what to do? I would say yes. The Torah and its commentaries show us how wise people of the past approached issues in their time, helping us to think and find a path forward for our time. Sometimes we are led to solutions of big problems, but if not, at least with methods with which to cope with them, to cope with the tension of unavoidable, contradictory, or ambiguous issues. Both these and those are the words of the living God. A great voice in Jewish scholarship was recently lost, that of Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the previous chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. Let's end with a few of words from his commentary, the words of the Lord, if you will. Judaism has sometimes been called a culture of argument. It is the only religious literature known to me whose key texts, the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, the codes of Jewish law, and a vast compendia of biblical interpretation, are anthologies of arguments. That is the glory of Judaism. The divine presence is to be found not in this voice against that, but in the totality of the conversation. And that is the conversation to which my faith journey led. Thank you very much.